Hi, welcome back. So let's continue with our next session and welcome to the stage Simon Cook, Director at Language Testing and Assessment Services. Hi Simon, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Anna. How are you?
Good. Okay, whenever you're ready to present, let me know.
Okay, here we go. I'll press to share the screen now, see if we get anywhere with that.
Yes.
Okay, are we sharing?
Yes.
Okay,
You can
fantastic.
begin now. Okay.
It's
The stage
afternoon
is all
here
yours,
in... Okay, we're all okay? Thank you, Anna. It's afternoon here in the UK, so I'll say good afternoon to you, but I'm aware that many of you are in different parts of the world, so whatever time of the day it is, I hope it's going well. The presentation I'd like to give you today fits in with this strand of operationalizing the ESP construct, in that it was something that was, in a sense, thrust upon us that we had to develop a test of English for aviation in the early part of the 2000s. It came about simply because the organization that oversees aviation worldwide suddenly realized that it was probably quite important that controllers and pilots should be able to understand each other. And so for the first time, introduced a language standard for pilots and air traffic controllers so that they would have, if you like, mutual comprehensibility. So here we go. So the new language standard was introduced by an organization called ICAO. In English, we call it ICAO, but I've heard in Spanish-speaking countries it referred to as ICAO and so forth. It's essentially a United Nations-sponsored agency, and the initialism stands for the International Civil Aviation Organization. Back in 1998, they'd realized that the number of incidents and accidents that had occurred and had cost the lives of upwards of 3,000 people had partially or completely been caused by a failure of the pilots and controllers, or the people taking part, to be able to understand the issues and to understand the language that was being used in communications. And so because of that, these accidents had taken place. So in 1998, the Assembly passed a resolution that they would investigate language proficiency issues. It's a United Nations sponsored organization, so they don't move particularly quickly, but in 2000 they established a study group, and the study group had the acronym PRICE for Proficiency Requirements in Common English. And the study group comprised language specialists, aviation specialists from all different areas of aviation operations, testing specialists, language trainers, and so forth. And the idea was that they would come together to try to hammer out, if you like, what would be a common standard of language proficiency that would be acceptable for aviation operations. In 2001, the Price Committee reported back to the Assembly, and in 2003, the ICAO member states voted to adopt a resolution that a new language proficiency standard should be introduced. When ICAO introduces a new standard for international civil aviation organizations, for international civil aviation, it generally allows 5 years for the various member states of ICAO to implement that standard. So although the standard was introduced and voted for in 2003, it wouldn't become mandatory for pilots and air traffic controllers to demonstrate this new proficiency language standard until 2008. In 2006, the standard got wider traction when it was adopted by the European Union as a directive for its own regulators, if you like, involved in specifying competencies for pilots and air traffic controllers. In 2008, the implementation deadline passed, but it seemed that in the period 2003 to 2008, many states hadn't really taken this particular requirement seriously, and a vast number of states, if there are, for example, 190 ICAO member states, I would say more than half had yet to implement the standard or yet to evidence that they had actually been able to meet the standard. So in 2008, ICAO allowed a transition period, a further 3 years, for the standard to be introduced into all the different countries, and it urged complying states not to in any way penalize the non-complying states if, for example, their pilots and controllers didn't necessarily show the language proficiency standard that was now accepted. In 2011, the transition period concluded. And so now in 2021, we were approaching we've just passed, if you like, the 10-year anniversary of the conclusion of the transition period and the 10 years of bedding in of this new particular standard. So what was the standard? Well, the standard essentially was a series of 5 holistic descriptors, so 5 descriptors of general language proficiency that defined what ICAO thought was communicative competence in plain English for aeronautical operations. Each of the descriptors began with proficient speakers shall, and then across the 5 descriptors, really ICAO hammered out what were the critical skills of operational language proficiency. From a learning and testing point of view, it can be seen that these 5 skills, called the holistic descriptors, they would form the constructs, the attributes that should be developed in the classroom and then should be demonstrated by means of a test and then should be demonstrated in professional operations. So they've said what the notion of proficiency is. Okay, you have to be proficient in these 5 skills. Then they also established a series of descriptions as to what operational proficiency meant. Across 6 different features of speech, they created descriptors, the sort that you would see in a rating scale, to say if people have language at this level of proficiency, then they are to be deemed proficient. They are to be deemed proficient speakers. So these rating scale descriptors became the means of identifying the minimum level of language proficiency that ICAO considered as being proficient, the minimum level that would be required. It should be noted that these language proficiencies, the new standard that's been introduced for pilots and controllers, was in relation to plain language, what ICAO termed plain language. I don't think that they were heading for a pun on that one, but they meant it as the spontaneous and creative use of non-coded language. Now, this is different from the radio telephone phraseology that possibly Colm referred to in his first presentation this morning, and it's separate entirely to the phraseology that pilots and controllers have to have in order to even have a license as a radio operator. So that was the first distinction. And the second one was that the new standard was in relation to the spoken language only. Although there's plans that data should be passed between controllers and pilots using the written word, at the moment, the spoken word is predominant. And even if the written word were to be introduced, the spoken word would still be required as the backup. So ICAO defined what it considered to be the constructs of proficient communication. It prescribed a means of identifying what was proficient, and then it produced a book, this manual on the implementation of the ICAO language proficiency requirements that gave more details on all of these things, plus an awful lot of other information besides. So what did ICAO think were the critical skills of operational language proficiency? Pilots and controllers should be able to communicate effectively, voice only, and in face-to-face situations. They should be able to communicate on the normal operational load when operations are standard, that they should have the language for dealing with standard operations. They should have a range of skills for, if you like, negotiating understanding, for when understanding fails or when they think the other person hasn't understood what they're trying to say, that there should be a range of strategies available to these people for making sure that the comprehension is there in the end, that comprehension is arrived at. And that could be either in these routine operations or in these what ICAO calls complications or unexpected turns of events. So not only should they be able to negotiate understanding in ordinary operations, but also in more challenging situations, in maydays, in emergencies, in urgency situations, that they should still have language for dealing with non-routine situations. And encompassing all of these really is the requirement that they should be able to use an accent or dialect which is generally intelligible to what they termed the aeronautical community. So they should be able to have these skills, and they should be able to produce language in an intelligible fashion from the point of view of pronunciation. So really, the holistic descriptors defined the communicative language traits that were to be developed in the classroom, but were also to be measured by some form of assessment. So that was what ICAO considered to be proficient, but then they needed to tell us what proficient meant, because proficient, for example, to a native English speaker might be different to a notion of proficiency to a Spanish speaker speaking English, or to a German speaker speaking English, and so on. So in tandem with these holistic descriptors, ICAO produced an operational level on its rating scale. And the operational level, the rating scale comprised 6 features of language description, if you like. The first 3 features, you could see there: pronunciation, structure, and vocabulary. These features what you can describe as the, if you like, the language systems. So the language users should have knowledge of the language systems to a particular level. They should have the skill of production of the language, which ICAO termed fluency, and the skill of reception, comprehension there. And at the top of the pyramid, if you like, the overarching goal would be that their interaction would be effective. It would be successful. So effective meant that it didn't have to be beautiful, it didn't have to be perfect, but it had to be workable. It must work in the end. These descriptors that you see here in this pyramid form, they formed level 4 on the language proficiency rating scale. And they formed, that level 4 was termed the operational level. There are other features of the language proficiency rating scale. It's a single scale, and is for the purpose of describing levels of proficiency in plain spoken language used in operational communications. So this is a scale that's specific to aviation. At most levels of the scale, it refers to the work-related context. So it particularly ties it in to the ESP constructs of aviation English, and specifically those areas of aviation English used in the operations of pilots and air traffic controllers. It has 6 subscales. We've just looked at the 6, 3 for language systems, 2 for language skills, and 1 for overall communicative competence. It has 6 levels of proficiency, from the pre-elementary level 1 to expert level 6. So if you like, it covers the spectrum of language from, if you like, complete beginner, almost somebody that has no knowledge of English at all, to the expert level, which would be considered the L1 speaker of English or the near L1 speaker of English. It's only to be used in describing the language of controllers and pilots. So when people try to use this particular scale and use it to describe the language of, say, new recruits on pilot training courses who have not been trained as pilots yet, it would be an inappropriate scale to use for measuring their language. Similarly, for air traffic controllers who have recruits who have yet to complete their air traffic controller course, it would not be an appropriate scale for them, because the scale is really only usable for people that have experience and knowledge of the aviation operations world. But it does provide the means of describing the extent of proficiency in the critical skills under the assessment, in the critical skills of operational proficiency. In many ways now, when ICAO produced the rating standard, the college where I was working, we'd been dealing with the training of air traffic controllers and pilots for 15 years, possibly even more. But up to that point, because there was no specific requirement for language for pilots and controllers, these courses were very much more aimed at improving general English, with some aspects of ESP introduced in the way that Colm was speaking about in his first presentation, particularly vocabulary. We would look at the vocabulary of aviation and try to improve the range and accuracy of their vocabulary use, backed up by development of grammar skills and so on. That could be general English grammar skills as much as they were aviation English grammar skills. But now finally we had a heading. We could see where we needed to go with these courses, and we could see what had to be done. The immediate impact of the introduction of the new standard was on classroom practice. We were required to look at ourselves, to be very reflective about what was happening at the college, and to completely revise our learning objectives to fit the new ICAO standard and the new ICAO requirements. We had to look at the learning outcomes. We had to look at our classroom practices, because no longer was it sufficient that people could recognize and accurately use vocabulary, for example, in multi-choice tests or written multi-choice tests. Now it had to be communicative. Now it had to be spoken language. There was a sea change coming on. We had to look at the training program. We had to review the syllabus. We had to direct the syllabus at developing the constructs of aviation English that ICAO had identified. We had to create new programs. We had a very much a changing learning environment. We had to change the balance of the programs, where before we may just taught 2/3 general English, 1/3 aviation English. These new standards required us to flip this around into a 2/3 aviation English program, 1/3 general English program. We had to retrain the training team. We had to look closely at the people who were writing the syllabus, the people who were writing the materials, and we had to make sure that they had a firm understanding of what the new requirements were. We also had to train the ESP trainer. We had to go back to basics and we had to take them down and introduce 4-week programs of aviation English training specifically and recertify them from that point. And we also had to, if you like, introduce the concepts of language assessments to these trainers so that they would at once become an ESP trainer and an ESP assessor in order to be able to understand just where their students were on the ICAO scale. We had to look at the methodological approach. The whole ICAO requirements required the communicative approach to language learning. ICAO was very much interested not in absolute grammatical accuracy, lexical accuracy, phonological accuracy. ICAO was much more interested in effective communication. So we had to lose the emphasis of making sure that each sentence produced was perfect and really focus not so much more now on the errors that were being made by the students. We had to focus on the meaning of what the students were trying to say. And if we understood the meaning, then really we were talking about students that were already approaching the operational level. So the approach had to be communicative, and we changed our method of teaching to very much a task-based approach. So again, going back to what David and Colm were saying earlier, the introduction of professional materials, the introduction of materials that they would see in their own operations, and then really just trying to get them to understand the nature of these materials, the language of these materials. And although they were familiar with these materials in their own language, how far could they go to explaining these concepts, these ideas, these domains, these topics effectively in English? So then it became very much a question of material selection and development. We had a range of existing materials, but then no new materials had yet been produced to meet the ICAO requirements. So it was very much a question of repurposing, recycling, if you like, what we had already, putting them together into courses of blended learning, but also in developing new resources that met the changing learning environment, the wider use of the language lab into multimedia labs, the burgeoning world of the internet, of YouTube, of the things that we could find there and incorporate somehow in our training programs. But we also had to consider an assessment process, because our clients were very interested to know just where their candidates sat on the ICAO scale, and therefore what resources they would then have to use in order to bring their air traffic controllers, to bring their pilots to the level required by the date required. We looked at different methods. We looked at classroom-based continuous formative assessment. This, going back to what Barry O'Sullivan was saying in the first, this formative assessment was specifically non-judgmental. It was used entirely to guide the students to understand what it was they needed to be able to do with the language, in a sense, so that they could almost self-assess where they were and realize the work that they needed to put in to get where they needed to be. But we also needed some kind of end of course summative assessment so that we could put this on the course reports that we sent back to our clients so that they would have a better idea. These were not certification. We couldn't issue certification of a particular level because we had no way of doing this. ICAO had produced a book, the implementation of the proficiency requirements, but up to that date, there were no public, if you like, public recorded samples of language proficiency. And all those involved in sort of language assessment of the spoken language will know that the rate of calibration by using rated speech samples is an essential part of that process. But we could offer, if you like, benchmarking, formative assessments to give a general idea where, based on our interpretation of the rating scale, we thought these students would be. But as 2008 approached, things changed. And now our clients were beginning to ask for an aviation test that could certify their controllers. And this is where the problems began for us. So we had to look at the development of a test, and we found a test. The test became the EALTS, the English for Aviation Language Testing System. But the development of it was very much in response to client needs. It wasn't ever something that the college set out to do. We had to develop a means of assessment that moved from benchmarking to certification. There was a degree of interest from testing industries to start with. In some of the early seminars I went to at ICAO, we had Cambridge Assessment were there, and Pearson were there, DynEd were there. There were a number of organizations that were interested at first. The interest waned, but there are reasons for that, which I can possibly come to later if time allows. The test had to be compliant with the ICAO regulations. It had to have validity, if you like, with the aviation industry. They had to see it as a useful test. We had to speak to our clients. We had to speak to the air traffic controllers and pilots, to our clients, to the training organizations of our clients, the training departments, in order to get consultation and feedback as to what they thought a test might look like. We had to look at models of good practice in language testing. So we looked at the ALTE standards, we looked at the Cambridge standards, we looked at there's a number of international ones that the name escapes me at the moment, but there were others as well. We had to, if you like, create or adopt a testing code of practice. We became very much focused on the VRIP principles of validity, reliability, impact, and practicality. We had to make considerations of quality of service, because ultimately, if we were to try and invest in a test, we had to make sure that we were offering a decent service to the people that came forward to take the test. In the beginning, we thought of this test only as a backup to the training programs that we were providing, because we would have lost the training programs at the college if we hadn't had a means of certifying the language proficiency at the end of the programs. This immediately created a slight conflict of interest because we were both the trainer and the assessor. And one of the ways we got around that was by separating the companies from the training company to an assessment company. We created an assessment company called LTAS, Language Testing and Assessment Services, which was working independently then of the training organization. So the VRIP principles, we looked at issues of validity. We looked at really establishing the construct validity for the whole test, essentially the test usefulness, looking at cognitive validity, context validity, scoring validity, all aspects of validity that would somehow help us to put together an argument, a logical process of creating an argument and creating evidence for the test that we were going to put together as being valid. We looked at reliability. We looked at ways of making the rating of our assessors consistent and reliable and accurate over time. And fortunately, at this time, ICAO did produce some rated speech samples, and we were able to make use of those. We had to consider the impact of the test on the classroom practice, what we were teaching in the classroom, on professional good practice, and these were considered as aspects of test washback. We had to consider the test practicality. The resources required to deliver a test and sustain a test could not be greater than the resources available to do that. And so if we put together a particular type of test that was too expensive or too resource heavy, it was never going to be efficient, sustainable, or cost-effective. The various EALTS development stages ran through the usual stages from planning, design, development, implementation to its operational phase. It had the components. It had an assessment for a check to see if somebody was of the expert level, so the L1 or near L1 speaker, and it had a separate test for people for whom English was a second or foreign language for non-L1 speakers of English. And that had two components. It had the test of speaking and the test of listening, and it had adaptations for pilots and controller license holders. It had 4 adaptations for different types of pilots, and it had 3 adaptations for different types of controllers. And this was necessary because of the requirement that we should test them within the context of their operations. Okay. I think I may be running out of time. Is that right?
Actually, yes, you're using some of the time for the questions. So if you want to answer.
Okay, so I'll share the slides. There are more slides, Anna, but I'll provide them to the presentation. And anyone that wants to ask me any questions about the other slides that come along further, then please, by all means, be in touch by email or whichever way you prefer.
Great.
Okay.
Great, Simon. I have a question here from Russell Hammond. He says, do you think there's a shortage of ESP constructs in different sectors? For example, tourism, health, engineering, etc. Some testing experts argue that more generic English testing should be applied for cost and resource challenges, but surely that is limiting the effectiveness of industry-specific competency measurement and monitoring.
That's an excellent question. I think that my own view on that is that the answer is that the test that you have to put together has to be representative, or the content of it must be representative of the target language use of the area where you are attempting to measure a construct, where you are attempting to measure language proficiency. And I think that if you go too general, then you risk the underrepresentation in your test of items that are specific to the people that you're trying to assess. And similarly, if you become too specific, you take a very narrow interpretation of what it is your people are, your candidates are asked to be able to do with the language. If you make that too narrow, then you're training more specifically for the test, and it doesn't really help them to have a safety net of more general language if their language competence in the area fails. So I think it's finding a balance between the very broad general English and the very, very narrow interpretation of language proficiency in a particular construct. For example, if you were to take only, Colm referred earlier to the use of the radio telephone by peacekeepers. If a course was limited only, or an exam was limited only to trying to replicate exactly and to simulate, if a test was tried only to simulate the exact activity of being on the radio telephone, then it would miss out an awful lot of the meta language that surrounds those types of communications. So I think I think the ESP specific testing is very pertinent, it's very important. And I think that a lot of people now would rather do the ESP and focus on the ESP in their training and testing in order to forward their professional careers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't see any other questions, but Russell says, thank you. Great answer. Is a balance. Thanks.
Yes, exactly. Always a balance. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attention then this afternoon. And as I say, the slides will be left with the new directions, presenters and moderators, and I'll be more than happy to answer any further questions. Thank you very much.
Simon. Thank you very much, Simon.